All right, so for our second talk, we have John Rush from Oracle talking about Oracle Jet, an open source project around JavaScript.
Yep, basically.
Thank you for being here.
All right. So just by show of hands, how many, and sorry if I don't, do I have to be close to the mic in order for the recording, or is?
No, you're good.
Good, okay. I coached soccer for 36 years, and I've never been accused of being a like soft talker, so if you can't hear me in the back, I will gladly speak louder. I'm a senior product manager at Oracle, and I actually started in the Java organization in Sun back when we actually had a fun company to work for before we got bought by a company called Oracle. I shouldn't say that, we're being recorded. I actually I do. I work in a really good group at Oracle, so it actually is rather nice. You know, as it is with most really large companies, it's what organization or what group you end up in the company as to whether you fit or not. And the one thing with this group, this thing's called Project Jet. JET stands for JavaScript Extension Toolkit, and it is a toolkit. It's designed so that you can use as little or as much as you want, and we'll go into it a little bit more. I'm going to try and use as few slides as I can and then go straight into code. So why am I even here? You know, I mean, I'm a JavaScript guy, right? And this is a Java user group, so why am I even here? I actually go to a lot of these, believe it or not. I've traveled around to Java ones all over the world. I just did a Java presentation in Sao Paulo, Brazil 3 weeks ago. We do a lot of situations where Java developers are being forced to understand JavaScript. And the UI paradigm, or this client-server architecture change that's starting to happen, where you're building more and more of the back end in Java with REST services and things of this nature, and then just exposing up those services, and the clients are being written entirely in the browser, in JavaScript and HTML and CSS, and they're connecting to those services that are being written in Java. Well, Oracle themselves, when we decided to truly embrace the cloud and started coming out with PaaS and SaaS, so platform as a service and SaaS as a service and IaaS, infrastructure as a service, all these things that we did as services, we had to also shift in this paradigm. And so our whole back end is still in Java. We still embrace it very heavily. But we started moving more and more of our cloud software in the client side into the JavaScript space. And that's where Jet came in. About 6 years, October will be 6 years for us ago, we started researching what was it we were going to do in this client space. Were we truly going to just stay in Java and reinvent something over there, or for our client, or were we going to go over to this pure client JavaScript side and figure out how we were going to do this new architecture? And that's kind of how Jet came into existence. Now, like I say, it's almost 6 years old, but we open sourced it, or we originally wrote it with the intent of open sourcing it. We used it internally to stand up some commercial products, make sure they were scalable and working, and then we open sourced it 2 years ago. We actually open sourced it on Leap Day of 2016. It's one of the few times I've actually shipped or slipped a release of a product on purpose. The engineers were screaming because they were ready to go 2 weeks earlier, and I said, no, we're going out on Leap Day. So we delayed the release until we went out on Leap Day. Well, that was a fancy thing. I didn't even know I had that. That's cool.
You saved a lot of money on anniversary.
What's that?
You saved a lot of money on having anniversary.
Yes, very true.
Celebrations.
So Jet is open sourced under the Universal Permissive License, which is actually more permissive than the MIT license even. You can do anything you want with this product. You take it and run with it, do anything you want. I actually had like a 15 email exchange going back and forth with a guy going, yeah, it's open source, but. And I'm like, no, go read the license. It's one paragraph. Now, I've read the license, but it's Oracle. What else? It can't be, right? And we went back and forth and back and forth. It truly is open source. You can do whatever you want. It's all up on GitHub. We use it for our own PaaS and SaaS offerings. We actually use it to sell our cloud software. So we're open source, we're free. I don't make any money on this. My sales teams don't make any money off selling Jet. But what they do is it allows us to get into a JavaScript shop. It allows us to get into a company that is purely JavaScript, Angular, React, whatever, where we had sales guys going in and they would say, so what's Oracle doing with JavaScript? And we go, well, we have ADF. and get lost. But now we've actually got a JavaScript story, and we can go in. It doesn't always sell Jet. They don't always use that, but it shows how we're looking at architectures, how we're building our own software, and they decide which way they want to go. A lot of our partners and customers are starting to pick up on this new model, and I'll show a little bit about our success stories and some of our customers as well. And then the extension mechanism for our SaaS software. So Oracle has this big thing called Fusion Applications, and there are methods that you use to extend those applications and adding in your own capabilities and things of that nature. And all of the future development in that SaaS space, which was done in what Oracle called ADF, their Application Development Framework, all of that's being done in Jet going forward. So this is just some screenshots of some of the different apps that are out there today that are using Jet, and a lot of our visualizations, because they're the prettiest to put up on a slide. There's a lot of boring tables and text and things like that too, but these look better, so we put these up here. Oracle's data visual analytics, all the scientific data and the big data side of it, all of our IoT cloud service, mobile cloud service, Oracle's management cloud service, all of that completely written in Jet. We also do mobile, so Jet is pure client side. It runs in the browser. The browser is our operating system. So we're able to take things like Cordova and build hybrid mobile applications on different devices. We can go iOS, Android, and Windows Surface 10, Surface Pro tablets in 10. And we've got quite a few different customers that are doing mobile. Mobile was one of the first things that we got picked up on, actually, because doing JavaScript in a mobile app is actually very, very quick for enterprise-type applications. We're not talking about building games. We're not talking about doing real graphics-intensive stuff, which you wouldn't do with Cordova or a hybrid app. You do those in native. But in business apps, doing hybrid is actually really practical, and having that single source code that you can deal with on desktop and then change up the views and so forth for better interaction models on mobile, but using the same business logic behind it. So we do a lot of mobile as well. Traditionally, like I said, we had ADF. We still have Apex itself, which ships with the Oracle database. Apex actually includes Jet now for all of its charts and graphs and gauges and so forth. And then Oracle Forms still exists. Oracle Forms was the thing that came around, I don't know how long ago, really early, 90s or something. And it's still around, and we're starting to do a little bit of front-end stuff for Forms in Jet. So this was a Java solution, this was SQL or PLSQL, this was Java as well. And now we've got JavaScript coming from Oracle as well. When you get into JavaScript though, such as Marcus was mentioning, our JavaScript is a crazy world. It's constantly changing. You know, if whoever came up and this quote has been attributed to multiple people, but you know, the only constant in life is change. And I swear the person was a JavaScript developer. But it's, you know, we're constantly finding new things that are out there. And we always, I do an entire hour-long talk on this, and so I could go forever, but there's this whole thing of chasing the shiny object, right? It's that person just has to go after that new thing. Well, if you're building enterprise-grade applications, it may take you 6, 8, 9, maybe even a year to build out this whole application. Halfway through your application, something new comes out, you know, and so you're like, oh, I gotta go check that out. You can't do that in this world. So you've got to try and find something that allows you to still stay on what we call the leading edge, but not dropping to that bleeding edge. And it's a very fine line that you have to walk. You're still trying to find something that's been around long enough that it's fairly stable, or is stable. It's mature enough that you've seen you figure most of the bugs are out of it, and it's going to, you know, it's still well supported by an organization or something of that nature, or at least a group of people, not a single individual working out of his garage. Things of that nature, and then you can base yourself on these. And that's exactly what Jet did. We looked at a collection of open source libraries, and we decided to take those libraries that met specific needs in an application. So we looked for specific libraries that did just the binding layer, you know, taking the view stuff and mixing it or connecting it into your back end of your controllers. Something that just did lazy loading of resources and resource management, things like that. And we put together those libraries, and then by using those off the shelf in the community, we were able to focus on things for the enterprise grade stuff. So the accessibility is huge for us as well. Data visualizations and what we can do in those areas. Internationalization. All of our components ship out of the box in 28 languages and 196 locales, including full bidirectional. So if you drop into Hebrew, it will automatically reverse for you and go right to left. Same thing with Arabic and so forth. So we base ourselves on all of these types of environments and focus on those, and that's what Oracle brings into this open source world. And we base the other things on existing open source libraries. Libraries that we use today, jQuery is in there simply because everybody seems to use jQuery in the world. We try not to use it in our own product, but it's there. Knockout's what we use for our two-way data binding. A lot of people wonder why we still use Knockout and not something else, but quite honestly, it's a little small library that works really, really well for what it does. It just does our binding for us. Web components, which is the one over here in the corner, we'll talk a lot about that today. Required JS is what we use for lazy loading. We will support Webpack. That's another big buzzword that's out there today. We have that coming in the fall. And jQuery UI is where we started 6 years ago with our UI component set. There was just jQuery UI widgets were everywhere. They were ubiquitous, and you could just go out and grab anything you wanted. We're slowly replacing jQuery UI with web components as we move forward. And then Cordova we use for our mobile solutions. This is our stack. I kind of call it a marketecture. It's not really a true architecture, but the marketing people seem to like it. Our UI components, and then all of the different libraries that we do for touch and mobile enablement and so forth. All of our UI components are full touch and gesture enabled because we don't just do mobile phones. Our laptops are full touch enabled as well these days, and so even on a desktop app, we still have to be able to do touch. Knockout we use for our view model, and then we have a common model API as well, which helps us deal with AJAX and REST interfaces and things like that. But again, we are pure client side, so everything in the data side is all done through web services. REST, WebSocket, server-sent events, if you can kick Microsoft to the curb. They're the only browser that doesn't support server-sent events. So. And then we have routing and required JS, and required JS allows us to kind of lazy load these things so that your applications are more performant. So that's it. That's as far as slides go. Let's get into some code. So I saw that I was following Marcus, and Marcus was using Spring Boot. So I said, okay, well, I got to use Spring Boot too. And I went out onto the internet, and Matt Rabel does a kind of a Spring Boot Ionic Stormpath. He now works for Stormpath, so he's kind of put together this tutorial on how you can show Spring Boot as the REST backend, and then you can use a few other things. And he did it all in Angular and Ionic, and so we ripped off this backend last year actually, and we said, okay, well we can do all the front end in Jet, so this is what I'm going to use. This is the tutorial. You can grab it off there. Actually, it's a Maven project, so I was able to take NetBeans and just open it up because NetBeans automatically recognizes Maven projects. And I actually tore out the Stormpath stuff because I didn't want to go set up a Stormpath account. And I took out all the security because I didn't want to have to log into Stormpath. So it's right now just running straight up where it is. This goes off and returns a collection of beers. And it's actually in the controller. You'll see that it, yeah, here's my get mapping. So it's just going off to good beers, and it's going to return. And it actually has kind of a cool little filter in here where it kind of comes through and it says, it's going to return all the good beers, and it's going to filter out all the really just crappy garbage. So. Even though all the whole list of beers contains all of these things, it'll actually strip out Budweiser and UR. And then on the client side, so that's the back end, and that's actually already running. I've already started it up and it's running. And so if I were to hit that really quickly, and let's see, it's right here. It just returns JSON data out of the REST endpoint, and it returns all the different beers that are out there. So the application itself, and the sample app that Matt had written, it does kind of a goofy thing on the client where it pulls these REST endpoints, and then from there, let's see, I have a beer service that calls that REST endpoint, and then for every beer that's returned, it actually goes out and makes a call out to Giphy, and it does a search and it returns an animated GIF that goes with that beer. Now, any of us that have ever done live demos know very well that you don't take a random word and do a random search for graphics. Because you never know what you're going to get back. I had just simple beers in there, like Red Hook. Red Hook brought back really weird stuff. I had to take it out of my list of beers. So it was, yeah, there were a couple that were like, that wouldn't work in public, no, not safe for work. So we had to rip it out, and it actually took me longer to come up with a good set of beer names that didn't get really graphical in the image side of it. So anyway, so this is what we're doing on this, is we're just calling this back in so you know how we're getting the data and what we're going to do. Now with Jet itself, we have a command line utility called OJet, and to create an entire application is just OJet create, give it a name, and then we have starter templates. So I can say template equals nav drawer, which happens to be one of the starter templates. You can see all these starter templates that are on our website. And I would hit enter, and that would go off and do this npm load and everything else, which takes 2 or 3 minutes across the internet, depending on what you're doing, because it's literally going out and doing npm install and so forth. I am going to instead, I just ran that command a little bit earlier while Marcus was talking, and I am going to switch over to what I started. Also in the command line tooling, we have the ability to do an OJet serve and an OJet build. So it'll build your app or it will serve your app. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and just run it and serve it up. And this is just the base template that comes out without any extra code added to it or anything. This is just the default that when you first start it up. And so in 2 minutes, you get an application, oh yes, that says I'm already running on that listener. I ran into this earlier. Okay. Okay, I can change my listener port. Well, you know it's live code, folks. No, thanks. What was it? Default is 35.7.230, so 35.7. Oh, that was a whole lot of garbage. Okay, anyways, so it's up and running. You can see the app is actually running. It's just we have a live reload service that'll also there. So as you change the code, it's watching your code, and as soon as it changes, it automatically refreshes your browser, so you don't have to go and refresh the browser behind it. But what's cool about this is not only is this a little desktop app where you can click and it changes and so forth, you can also, it's fully responsive. So if I change this down to, say, a mobile device like this, it'll automatically change your pull down into a dialog at the bottom, which is what you would expect on a mobile device. I'm not sure, I want to close that, that's what I did. And then the menuing system at the top went over into a pull-out drawer and so forth. I can shrink this down a little bit. So now you can see the whole thing. If instead of showing it that way, I drag it down, and then you can can kind of see it a little bit more in a responsive fashion. But as you drag the browser across, at a certain point, it just drops into the new format and so forth. So if you opened it up on a phone, it would have this new layout and so forth, and that's what we can do with it. It's actually nice. Jet also provides what is called a responsive JavaScript. So the solution you were talking about where you've got some sort of a map or you've got graphics or something like that, in responsive development and responsive web design, one of the early steps that came about was you could shrink your browser down and you could use CSS to hide things or change their layouts and things like that. But if you hid a chart or a graph or a map, for instance, or something like that, behind the scenes, the JavaScript was still getting called for all of that, and you were still eating bandwidth. If you're on a mobile device, you're still eating battery, and all these kinds of things. So the Holy Grail was to get this responsive JavaScript, which we actually started to see about 3 years ago from a company called Zurb. Maybe you ever heard of a development product called Foundation from Zurb? Fantastic framework. We really, really liked it, and we stole a bunch of things from them. They were open source, what can we say? But they did some really cool stuff in this responsive JavaScript space. And so we kind of look at what they were doing and we made a few changes to what we wanted to do as well. But it allows you to simply set up these media queries or breakpoints of where your application is going to change responsively. And now you've got JavaScript variables where you can get true falses based on those types of things as well. And they're set up with observable arrays or observable variables, which is what Knockout does. So as they start to shrink down, they send out events when they change. So as your app starts to shrink down, you can actually change the JavaScript in the back end and load up different REST endpoints for smaller data if you're on a mobile device. Or if you hide a piece of code or a piece of DOM, don't even bother loading up the JavaScript for it. Or even better yet, do a conditional inside of your DOM and don't even load that chunk of DOM at all if it's on a smaller device. So you can do a lot of really cool things there too. So let's change over to the app itself that I wanted to show you. This is going to bomb out again as well, but at least on the responsive or the read live listener on it, but that's okay. So this app is actually going out and going to the REST endpoint and pulling up all these different figures, and it's pulling up the graphics and so forth that go to them. They're actually pretty cool. So if you pull up this, then you got a little image of your good morning coffee and so forth. And one of the things that when we put this together, I kind of wanted to show a little bit of how and why we were doing things. You were talking about VOD using web components. Well, Jet, everything in Jet is also based on web components. That's one of the coolest things that I like about what VOD is doing, is that we're both following the HTML5 web component spec. We're not off inventing our own component model somewhere. We're actually following standards. We're following specifications that allow us to start sharing UIs, which is something we've never really had before. And now we can actually create chunks of UI that can be shared across frameworks and shared across different development environments. And that's what Oracle's banking a lot of time on and a lot of effort on for our own resources, where we're building out UI components that can be used across the entire company from different groups on our global business unit side to our PaaS side software and things like that. So when I start to put this app together, I just define this thing called OJ Toolbar. And inside my toolbar, I have an OJ button and another OJ button. And they just have attributes on them that do certain things. In this particular case, I have an attribute called chroming. So in here, they're set up as full chrome, which if I look at the browser, it's got the full chrome on these buttons. And if I change that to be half chrome, I'll change it on both just so it looks the same. And I just save that. And I have to refresh because it's not doing the live reload. Normally that would just reload itself. And of course it did not come up. Why did it not save? Interesting. Okay, so we won't show that. I don't know why that didn't save. Okay. So you can change up different attributes and it just changes the styling and so forth. The classes that I'm using in here, this is using a thing called Font Awesome just for icon fonts, so I can easily integrate that in. We don't ship with that in Jet, that's an external thing that I integrated in to show different fonts. The list view that you see with everything being listed in is just simply one component called OJ List View. And then what we do is we try to provide components that are very extensible and very customizable from the end user's point of view. So in this particular case, I have a list view, and then I can set the basic layout of that, like a certain width and so forth. And then I have a renderer that says on every item that's going to go into my list, send it through this renderer. And that renderer is going down here to this beer template. And if I come down, here's my beer template. And again, it's just a list element. So it's all JavaScript, it's HTML. We're not doing anything proprietary, it's just straight up HTML. And it says, grab the ID, bind it to the ID that's coming in for this element, take the source and bind it to the image that's actually coming in for this element. And we just walk through every single item that's coming out of your REST endpoint and drop it into here. So now you can display it. So it's really easy to customize what all this stuff is going to look like, even though it's all the same list view element. It's up to you to what you want to do. And then behind the scenes on all of this, we're really just taking, here's the change handler. So when we showed earlier, if something changed inside of that, then there's an event. Just as Marcus was talking about earlier, everything's on event listeners and so forth. So there's a callback method that when you have an event fired, this is what happens. And in here, I'm going to go in and look at the component or the element inside of that list, and I'm going to get the information about it, and I'm going to see if it's selected, then I can enable my edit button. So you saw in here that this button is actually disabled until something is selected. And once it's selected, now I can click on it. So we're doing different things like that. When you deselect it, it goes away. And the same thing with the add button. So if I want to add a beer, and let's say there was one really cool one that I liked because I liked the image that it came up with. It's called Bilge Wrap Porter. It's actually a good beer. I've had it too. But the Bilge Wrap Porter goes out and grabs, and it's actually a really cool image. So let's select that and show it. So. And that added it. That actually did a REST point, added it in through the REST endpoint, and then just the components, the collection components. The one thing that Jet really focuses on is that our UI elements are simply representations of the data behind them. So the list view is just a representation of the array that's behind it. You want to filter it, filter the array, and the view just automatically updates. You don't have to do anything in the view itself. Same thing with our data visualizations. You want to modify something in the data, the way that a bar chart works or something like that. Mess with the data, and the chart will automatically change for you. You don't have to do stuff in the chart. When we look at components, I wanted to kind of show a little bit about what Jet does as well. So the Jet website is at oraclejet.org, very easy to get to. It has the Get Started page like everybody else. There's a lot of different ways to get started with Jet. We do have a visual developer that's a cloud service that you can go off and do drag and drop and set properties and things of that nature. So if you're not really into the code side of it, you can go this direction. There is a code button in that editor where you can actually just swap down to a regular IDE and work on the code. So we also have our command line tooling, which I talked about a minute ago. So pulling this down, it shows you, here's how you get started. You do the install of the CLI, and then follow those steps. If you just want to kind of look at the code, which we're talking about tonight, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense, there's even a JS Fiddle that we have. So you can go over to the JS Fiddle and kind of change things up in a live environment without having to install anything on your machine. You just want to play around, you can do that. So a lot of different ways to go there. Probably one of the coolest things we have though is this thing called a cookbook. The cookbook lists every single component that we provide, component and some framework features and things like that, like routers and things of this nature. There are a lot of them, and you can just click on the alphabetical list if you want to see the entire list of everything that's in here. But it goes even deeper than just the individual elements. So if we go into, say, collections, and we look at that list view that we had a minute ago, well, the list view, the basic list view is just static content. It just kind of shows you how to do this. It actually shows you, oh, my browser's too small. Hang on. In a smaller browser, we can go over some of the things for this. There it goes, okay. So I know it's a little bit smaller, but what we have over here on the side is full live code of what you see over here. So I can actually change up things on this right side, such as, let's say I change Amy's name to Fred, and just hit apply, and you'll see it changes live. So we can look at our JS docs, just as you would with your Java docs. We have JS docs as well. And you can look at the full API for all of our components. You can mess with the changes right here live in our demos. You can also copy and paste the code out of our demos into your application. And let's face it, for JavaScript developers, that's pretty much our programming model, right? We copy, we paste. It's just kind of the way it works, and then we tweak to make it work. But we can get really complex in here. So we can do things like external sort and filter controls. Again, this part right here that you're seeing with these three items, that's the list view. Everything else around the outside is just extra stuff that's added in to enable the filtering of the data underneath it, and then it changes up the list view. So this is the type of thing that we provide the entire source code for, so you could add this to your application and just modify the data underneath and that sort of thing. But you can also, and I know I'm right up against the end of time here, you could also turn around and take something like this and create your own custom component, so your own web component. So let's say you did have a company standard where you've got a list view and you want filters across the top, or maybe you want filters down the side or something, but you want it to be a standard that your company design, your UX people have come up with or so forth. You could create your own component that puts all these things together, and then you just hand that component around for everybody to use. In this case, I actually took that kind of a filter scenario with a table, and you'll see here, all I have in this HTML is just filtered list, and I'm passing in some data. As a matter of fact, I'm not even going to do that first. I'm going to take that out of the data part out of that. I'm going to get rid of that. So all I've got is filtered list. And when I save that and I run it, now this is running from that same app, so if I go over to the incidents tab, it loads up a table, and it's got a filter capability, so if I do something like AAS, then it starts to highlight and filters the list down really quickly. So this entire UI with all of this is really in the DOM just that for the developer. That's all they have to do. Everything else behind the scenes is encapsulated inside of this web component. And that web component sits inside of a structure, we call them jet composites, but it's called filtered list. And under filtered list, it has a view, and it has a view model, or a controller if you want. It has its own CSS, and it also has this thing called components, or component.json, which is metadata that describes the properties or the attributes that you want to define. And you can define events, you can define methods, all these different kinds, and slots, which are regions inside of your component that someone else can add extra DOM into on the fly. So you can actually say, I have this square area, this bottom part is a footer, for instance, and you can put anything you want in that footer just by saying this DOM goes in slot equals footer, and my component will look for something with that slot and stick it in there. So there's some really cool ways you can extend all this stuff, and this is all following the web component spec. The Vaadin stuff does the exact same stuff. So it's pretty cool. In this particular case, I set up a property called data. Because let's face it, if I actually had this filtered list, and it went out and got its own data, that's a pretty crazy reusable component that just get your own data every single time. You want to be able to pass the data into your component if it's going to be reusable. You have to think very carefully when you build these components. So in this case, behind the scenes, or behind the code, in instance.js, I actually created an array here called department array. In the component, in the view model for the component, I basically say if there's actually a property called data, then use it. Otherwise, use this kind of temporary data, maybe development data, if you will, in here. So right now you'll see that in that first one, the department name is saying ADF PM 101 blah blah blah. And if we go look at it, and I clear out my listing, oh, it's pulling up the old stuff because it's just not reloading properly. That's the part with the where it was not reloading before. If you, in here, when I had the data on there, so without the data, it's going to say, hey, this doesn't exist, so load up the basic stuff. But when I add the data back in, now it's going to say, the data attribute is bound to a local variable in this that I'm passing in, so go ahead and use that. And inside of that data, I had the first the department name set to, my passed in array. And so that's why when we look at it, it's actually saying my passed in array. So there's some pretty cool stuff you can do there. The last point I wanted to make, and finish up on time here, the last point I wanted to make is all of that work that I was doing to create those components. If I want to actually create my own component in Jet, you would think, oh, there's like 6 different files there, you have to know the directory structure, all those other kinds of things. The Jet command line tooling is ojet, create component, do my chart. Web components, the naming of a web component, according to spec, it has to have a hyphen in it. The name does. And because you're creating DOM elements, it's kind of just a best practice that you use that first part as your own namespace. Like all of our components are OJ something. So if your company is Disney dot whatever, or DSY or whatever. That way your components stand out, and you don't want to write your own custom component called button, because there's already buttons out there. That kind of thing. So that's it. I say ojet create component, hold my chart, done. That's it. And what it did was it created that entire directory structure in here called my chart. And now I actually have a view, and I have a view model, and I can just go through and add and copy and paste things out of the cookbook and put them in here and run them. So you can really quickly build up new components very, very easily. I know that was really fast. I ran 45 minutes down into 35 minutes. So questions? Okay. Yes?
What's the current build and vinification system used? You mentioned you're going to switch to Webpack eventually, but what's the
Right.
current?
Yeah, right now we use require.js and we use RJS for bundling, and we use Uglify and anything else in the ES6 world that you can use. We use Uglify in our minification process right now. Webpack will be out with Jet 6, which comes out in October. We have multiple teams internally using it right now. We're just kind of cleaning things up and doing some things in that area. There are actually some pretty severe limitations to Webpack when you get into the enterprise space that we're writing some plugins to fix. So, RJS works great, but everybody thinks it's their old, their grandfather's loading system because it's been around for 8 years or something like that. But it works really, really well for asynchronous loading. Any other questions? Stunned you into silence. Yeah, I know, JavaScript, oh heck. Okay, thank you very much for your time, I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, John.